Hi there, everyone. Michael A. Bryan from the Oraculos School of Astrology, and welcome to Michael Fix My Stars, my new astrology hotline where I help real people troubleshoot real challenges that they face within their lives using the wisdom of astrology.
Well, first of all, I'm also a Gemini rising, so um, yeah, that was pretty interesting. And my concerns are also around the eclipse. I know that it is falling in my fifth house, and the reason for my concern is that my daughter is currently in Israel, and I've been pretty freaked out the last couple days. Um, she has a she has a flight home on the 14th, actually on the day of the eclipse. So I'm just concerned, basically for her safety. Yeah, that's kind of what's going on with me.
So, what we're going to do is take a look at the soul return chart of this caller. And the reason for that is because the soul return chart pretty much lays out the groundwork of what's going to manifest within the life of a person within a 12-month period. And so within this chart, we always use the birth location of the native, and this is a potentially contentious point in traditional astrology about where should we cast the soul return chart for. I use soul returns daily within my natal astrology practice. I've never had a reason to use the soul return chart for the relocated location, and never would I. So we use the natal location of the soul return chart, period. But the reason for this is because the soul return can give us an indication of what's going to be most highlighted within the life of the native within this coming period of time. So let's just take a quick look and see whether or not we can see any of the things that she's already spoken about, or whether or not we can give an indication of what's going to be coming up in general within this next 12-month period of her life. Now, the first thing that we see here is that 8 degrees of Gemini, 6 minutes is rising, and that is in her natal 12th house. I have a student by the name of Jack Kowaleski, who's one of the people who's currently giving readings at the Oraculos School of Astrology. And Jack made the iconic statement in class once that when a person has their 12th house rising within a soul return year, that is a year where that person should just lay on the floor for the entire year. And what he meant by that was that very often when we have the 12th house rising, it can manifest as a period where it feels as if there's very little that's within our specific control. And as a result of that, it can also feel like we don't actually have the ability to do much as far as affecting a change in a particular direction that we want that change to move. So I think that when we have the 12th house rising, there's this larger understanding that we have to let go and let God to a very large degree, where there really isn't anything that we can actively do to influence how our circumstances are going to unfold. And very often, when people have the 12th house rising within the soul return chart, that can feel like a very frustrating set of experiences because we find ourselves, there's a word for it, but we find ourselves essentially glued in such a way whereas we cannot take the sort of forward action that we want to take. We can't actually change what's going on within the lives of those around us. We can't do anything. And so there can be a feeling of frustration that manifests within the life of a person when they have their 12th house rising. There can also be a feeling of a silent suffering. And that silent suffering can arise out of the sense of, I really can't do anything to shift what's going on in the front of me. So I really just have to wait and see how things unfold. So the 12th house rising represents a very tricky period of time from an astrological perspective in general, but it also represents this period of time where we have to learn how to rely more fully on our own faith, and we have to learn how to rely more fully on things that are much larger than us, because we can't actually do anything. As far as cosmic impetus is concerned, the 12th house rising usually shows a year where we have very little of it in order to move things in a direction that we desire them to move. So I think that's the first thing worth knowing in looking at the soul return chart. Now we're going to take a look at some other things, and immediately what caught my eye in this, even though I'm not necessarily a catch my eye sort of astrologer, and the reason for that is because I believe in doing things in a systematic way. But what caught my eye within the solar return chart itself is that she has a new moon in the solar return chart. Now, earlier I spoke about how, from a traditional astrological perspective, we tend to emphasize the new moon even more than we do the full moon from the perspective of making concrete predictions. And so it's interesting to see how these two things have kind of bled into each other, because here we see an example of just that. So, having this new moon within her soul return chart is a very powerful indication, and it's a very huge omen. Whenever we have any of the major lunar phases, so that's either the conjunction, the opposition, or either of the two squares between the luminaries occurring within a soul return chart, it can represent a major chapter year within our lives. And there's no year within our lives that's really going to be much larger than the year where we have the new moon within the solar return chart. When we have the new moon or any of the major lunar phases occurring within our solar return chart, it represents that this is going to be a major chapter turner of a year within our lives, and that we end up thinking back on this year as being a year that we will remember forever. And I think for a lot of people who are currently within this state of navigating their lives, as we see a lot of what's unfolding in Israel, this is going to be a major chapter year within our lives forever. And those of us who are closer to that conflict, we're probably going to have that manifesting more strongly within the context of our charts. And here we see that really manifesting very strongly within the chart of this native, with her having the new moon in the fourth house. The new moon in the fourth house indicates to us that the major chapter unfolding that she's going to have this year is going to have to deal with her family and her domestic life in general. And we already see that manifesting for her within the context of how this year is unfolding. So that's another thing that we see going on within this chart, and it's something that we just want to keep our eye on. Now, just coming back over here to what else we see happening here, we have the Venus at 18 degrees Leo, 42 minutes retrograde, and that Venus, by the 5 degree rule, is also in the fourth house. Venus within this chart is ruling the 12th house. And so that can be another indication for her that a lot of her concern or emphasis this year is going to be channeled more specifically within the domestic landscape of her family, her home, her children, and things to that effect. We also see that the Venus is the co ruler of the fifth house within this chart, and that's also indicative that the issues surrounding her children are going to be the issues that are manifesting or coming up the most for her within this coming period. So this is really pointing more specifically towards what she spoke about earlier as far as her children are concerned. It isn't really pointing towards art as a particular pursuit, because at this moment we see that factor of things, or we see that the well being of her children is really the thing that's manifesting the most strongly within the soul return chart. And that's probably what's taking up the majority of the space within the context of the home scenario. Now, as we go through, I'm just looking to see what other major things we have happening that we can quickly say to the native about this coming 12-month period. And I'm just going to take a look at aspects occurring to the solar return ascendant from her natal chart. We have the Uranus in a sextile relationship to the solar return ascendant from the natal chart. Uranus in her natal chart is, by the 5 degree rule, in the third house, because if you take the number 5 and you slap it onto the number 8, you end up with the number 13. So Uranus is in the third house, making a sextile relationship to her ascendant, and that can be an indication that one of the positive things that's unfolding for her this year has to do with travel. And one of the positive things, or one of the positive gifts unfolding for her this year, is the gift that Uranus brings in her third house of short journeys. Now, the reality is that the third house and the ninth house exist on a trajectory of travel. And short journeys are relative, truthfully, because if you are from a country and making a trip to that country, that might feel like a short journey to you because you're going back to some place that you're familiar with. So I just want to check in with you. Was your daughter just vacationing there, or is that someplace that she lives, or what's her relationship to the country?
She went there 3 months ago to work there, but also she has a boyfriend that was in her company, so she went to go be with him, and then she was actually going to do Aliyah and become a Israel citizen, and she was wrapping everything up, and she was due to leave at the end of October, and then the war broke out. So yeah, she had already made up her mind to come home. But that's why she was there. It was both work and love. And she's a Taurus, 23 degrees Taurus with Leo rising, and she got there right after the Venus went retrograde on her ascendant. So it's been kind of a wild ride.
Got it, got it. Okay, so from the perspective of her daughter making Aliyah, which is something that's available to Jewish people to be able to live in Israel if they're from Jewish descent or if they're currently practicing Jews. But one of the things with that could indicate, or we could see that being a factor here with the Uranus in the third house, making the sextile relationship to the ascendant, because Uranus is a planet that we associate with aviation. Sometimes people have Uranus in their 10th house when they're pilots or when they're flight attendants. So Uranus has to do with aviation. So we see Uranus in the third house of community, a familiar community, and to a very large degree within the Jewish community, Israel does, whether or not you are currently living in Israel or whether or not you're Jewish and outside of Israel, Israel does represent a third house place of familiar community to me, basically, or to that person. So having Uranus in the third house of local community, representing flights, representing planes, making a sextile relationship to the ascendant, in the soul return chart could be a very positive omen that's indicating that this is going to be a period of time in which the gift that Uranus brings from this native's third house is the return of her daughter safely to the US. Now, another thing that I think is a great indication within the soul return chart that can also be pointing to that same direction is that we have Jupiter within the soul return chart in the 12th house of the soul return chart, ruling the 11th house, which represents the fulfillment of the desires of the native. The 11th house within anybody's chart represents the fulfillment of their desires. And we see this Jupiter within the 12th house. The ancients had this aphorism that if you have Jupiter in the 12th house, it's indicative of the fact that you have, it's actually not the ancients. Sorry, ancients. We always blame things on the ancients when we don't actually know who to blame it on. But there's this notion within our larger astrological kingdom that when we have Jupiter in the 12th house, it can be something that protects us from the larger afflictions of the 12th house. And it was actually the ancients who said that. I just had to check my memory palace. It was indeed the ancients who said that having Jupiter in the 12th house can save us from some of the afflictions of the 12th house. And so here we have the Jupiter in the 12th house, which can be a boon of blessedness for the native as she navigates this challenging period. And we also have Mercury representing her daughter in her own 5th house in the soul return chart. And Mercury is in Virgo, which we know is the domicile and the exaltation of Mercury, which can indicate a sense of safety or protectedness for her daughter within the context of her upcoming travel. So that's one of the things we see. And we see that Mercury and Jupiter being in a lovely trine relationship. Mercury has just separated from the Dexter trine to Jupiter in the 12th house, which can also be another indication of blessedness for the daughter as she makes this travel overseas. Surely there is reason to be in a state of fear in relationship to what's going to be occurring within the daughter's life, because we have Mars ruling the 6th house of stress and sickness within the 5th house, which is the house of the daughter within this chart. So there is this feeling of there being a heightened sense of stress surrounding this specific topic for the native. But I dare say that based on the relationship between the Mercury in the fifth house, in the very good state that it's in, and the Jupiter in the 12th house, in the trine relationship that it's in with that Mercury, is indicating a safe passage for the native's daughter within her upcoming trip from Israel.
That was great. Thank you. That made a lot of sense. I appreciate it.
Wonderful, wonderful. So keep us in the loop, yes? You could send me an email and let me know when she lands, okay?
I will. Thank you so much.
Thank you. If you've enjoyed today's show, then please remember to hit subscribe down below. I'm currently on a mission to get 12,000 subscribers across all platforms, which includes YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify by the end of November 2023. And it's a tall order, but I'm pretty sure we can do it because we make some really good astrological content here on the Oraculos Podcast. So please remember to hit subscribe down below, hit the notification bell so that you receive notifications of when we come out with these episodes on a daily basis. And please share the Oraculos Podcast with your other astrologically minded friends so that more and more people can know about the amazing work that we're doing over here on the Oraculos Podcast.